Yeah, I bet some of you thought I was kidding last week. I'm afraid not, because today we are going to be talking about the dungeon names for Ocarina of Time and Majora's Mask. Why only the dungeon names? Because of how much of a missed opportunity they are, and more importantly, why they're such a missed opportunity. Alright, before we go any further, I'm going to admit flat out that the entirety of today's topic is nitpicking of the highest order. The Zelda series has always had narrative as distinctly secondary on the priority ladder, and dungeon names are an admittedly small part of the narrative, so they aren't normally given much thought, when they're given any thought at all. So, with all that being the case, why am I making an entire video to gripe about the dungeon names for the first two 3D Zelda games? Well, it's actually pretty simple. People don't spare a lot of thought for names, but they are incredibly important. You can actually say a lot with the name of a place. People don't really think about the name Death Mountain anymore, but it's a pretty evocative name. It makes you think of challenge, of difficulty, of strenuous trials. A fitting name for what was once one of the most dangerous areas in the early Zelda games. The Lost Woods is another case, indicating a feeling of confusion, aimlessness, and, yes, of getting lost. But location names don't even always have to be meaningful and evocative. A lot of the time, a location name simply needs to be informative. Hyrule Castle Town pretty much tells you everything you need to know about the place. It's a town by Hyrule Castle. That's really all we need. Time to move on. The same goes with places like Goron Village or Zora's Domain. In a single name, we know what this place is, plus they just work as regular names. Kakariko Village is another example. It's a village. That's all you need to know. Let's move on. Now, before we go any further, yes, I know names like Death Mountain and Lost Woods have started to lose their meaning in later Zelda games. Death Mountain in particular just became that one mountain in Hyrule rather than anything particularly significant. Lost Woods at least kept up a semblance of being a difficult maze. This is due to adherence to the naming conventions of the Zelda series, which is also why Kakariko Village keeps showing up as that one village in Hyrule. This is an issue, especially when it takes away from the meaning behind a name, but I can understand why they did it, especially as Zelda overworlds have generally become less challenging to traverse. Death Mountain actually is still one of the harder overworld areas to traverse in later Zelda games, but that's generally like saying walking up the steps is harder than walking across flat ground. Technically true, but no one really notices. However, none of that is actually what I want to discuss today. No, today I want to talk about the fact that even if you look at the dungeon names for Ocarina of Time and Majora's Mask while completely disregarding the rest of the series, they're just awful. These dungeon names are entirely uninformative and may actually be detrimental to the dungeon design. Yes, these dungeon names are so terrible, they might negatively impact the dungeon itself, because it lets down the dungeon design. Now, I'm sure some of you, hell, probably a lot of you, are wondering just what the hell I'm on about. Well, let's take a look at an example, and I'll explain what I mean. In Ocarina of Time, after you first become adult Link, you return to where you started your adventure, Kokiri Forest. Now, this place is Link's childhood home. It's where he grew up, and it's where all of his childhood friends live. It's also, in this dark future that we have to save, completely infested by monsters, and everyone is hiding inside in fear. Link's best friend, and his biggest rival, headed into the Lost Woods in order to try and root out the cause of this spread of evil. You follow them, and after getting past your rival and through a maze filled with pissed-off moblins, you find the source of your evil infecting Kokiri Forest, and you go inside. The place appears to be an old mansion, ruined and haunted. Monsters roam freely, and disembodied hands drag helpless prey to parts unknown before leaving them at the entrance to the mansion. Four ghostly sisters seal off the mansion's basement, and skeletal knights guard items of importance within the mansion's halls. To make matters worse, after completing the dungeon, you are told that Link is not a native of the forest. A terrible war ravaged Hyrule, and a desperate mother took her son to the forest so that he may survive. Could this war be what made this mansion into a den of evil? Even worse, with it being so close to the forest, Could this be where Link lived before he came to the forest? Could his mother escape from whatever curse befell it in order to bring Link to the nearby haven of Kokiri Forest, even at the cost of her own life? Of course not! None of that spooky atmosphere, none of that potential storytelling means a damn thing. Why? Because the moment you enter the dungeon, it flat out tells you that this is the Forest Temple. Yep, this is just a really spooky place where people come to commune with or pray to the forest. Nothing more, despite what the dungeon design was indicating. It's just a place for the Saints of the Forest to hang out. You see what I mean about the dungeon names being potentially detrimental to the dungeon design now? Even at best, they're bland and uninspired. At worst, they're damaging. The Forest Temple could have been great storytelling, but nope, it's just the Forest Temple. What's worse is... Sorry. I stutter and it's getting bad. What's worse is that this continues through the rest of the game. A heavily monster-infested labyrinth with lots of prison cells that almost seem to be designed to hold the massively strong Gorons. Just the Fire Temple. An obstacle course designed around controlling the flow of water, a reflective element, where you fight your own dark reflection near the bottom before having to climb back to the top of the dungeon to face its final challenge. Just the Water Temple. What appears to be the literal gateway to hell. Just the Shadow Temple. A place that appears to be a sacred gathering place with a massive statue in the likeness of a divine version of those who live near it. Okay, maybe calling that one the Spirit Temple actually makes some sense. But you see what I'm getting at, right? With the possible exception of the Spirit Temple, and even then more could have been done with that name, none of the dungeon names even describe the location. They're just generic insert dungeon name here names that don't tell you anything about the location, much less aim to be meaningful. Even some of the mini-dungeons aren't immune to this, although most of them are admittedly fine. Gerudo's Fortress and Gerudo's Training Grounds are perfectly fine, and the same goes for Inside the Great Deku Tree, Dodongo's Cavern, and Inside Jabu Jabu's Belly. However, while Ice Cavern is at least indicative of what kind of place it is, given that the place is the source of the Ice over Zora's domain, it is a little bland. Bottom of the Well is technically accurate, but the dungeon itself is a massive collection of prison cells and torture chambers beneath Kakariko Village, and the boss fight, for lack of a better term, is a ghoulish figure that you fight in a literal bone pit. More could definitely been done with that name. Really quick, I'm going to pause to address a few things. I didn't talk about Phantom Ganon in my description of the Forest Temple because he is actually given an explanation. Yes, a monster that appears to live in cursed paintings and takes the form of your greatest enemy could have made for some great storytelling. But, especially if more had been done with the Forest Temple. But the explanation we're given works well enough for what it is. And yes, I am aware that before you get to the Forest Temple, you are told of a war in the ancient past that ended with the Sacred Realm being sealed away from the rest of Hyrule. The 5 temples could be where the Sacred Realm was split from Hyrule, or sealed away from Hyrule, however that worked, and the dungeons could be leftovers from that original war. That could justify the incredibly bland names, I'll admit. However, nothing really indicates that, and it's sort of undercut by Majora's Mask. See, Majora's Mask takes place in a completely different place, Termina. Termina has a very different backstory from Hyrule, and there's no mention of a sacred realm or any war surrounding it. In fact, there don't seem to be any ancient evils in Termina's past, just the slow but nearly all-consuming decay of the land as it slides inexorably towards ruin unless someone sets it to rights. Well, that and the ancient cursed mask that wants to slam the moon into Termina to destroy it, but that doesn't seem to have any real roots in Termina's history. Majora's just kind of a dick like that. However, despite that, Majora's Mask uses the same dungeon theme naming as Ocarina of Time. In fact, it repeats the issues with the Forest Temple almost verbatim. Early on, you visit a cursed swamp. The very water of the swamp itself has been poisoned, and the king's daughter has been taken prisoner by monsters. At the heart of Woodfall Swamp lies an ancient structure that you call up from where it sank beneath the swamp. It appears to be a mansion of sorts, taken over by trees with parts of the lower floors flooded by poisonous water, with a great mechanical flower in the center that seems to be the source of the poison, for the poison abates when you lift the flower out of the water. In command of it all is a great giant, masked and malevolent, who seems bent on stopping any who would free the princess. Not that any of that potential storytelling matters, because it's just the Woodfall Temple, as the game helpfully points out when you enter it. And again, the rest of the major dungeons are like this. An ominous tower from which emanates a wind that freezes the very mountains. Just Snowhead Temple, which, to be fair, at least kinda sounds on point. An ancient mass of water-powered machinery that seems to be turning the very ocean itself sick. Just Great Bay Temple. A tower that seems to climb to the heavens, only to reverse and send those who climb it to a desert limbo, and traps the souls of those who die in the land around it, complete with statues depicting the defacement of the Triforce, the very symbol of the goddesses of Hyrule, and a great flaming finger pointing at the sky? Just Stone Tower Temple. Majora's Mask makes the same misstep as Ocarina of Time, but this time there's not any justification that I could find that could be stretched to try and explain this theme naming. These placeholder names make even less sense than in Ocarina of Time, where the presence of the sages and the old war that ended in the sealing of the Sacred Realm could maybe justify each major dungeon being a temple. In Termina, this is apparently just how they build their places of worship, filled to the rim with traps, monsters, and radiating evil, corruption, and decay. Thanks, but if going to a church involves having to go all the way through that every Sunday, I think I'll just stay home. Again, the mini-dungeons are mostly fine. In fact, the mini-dungeons in Majora's Mask are arguably better than those in Ocarina of Time, as far as names go. Pirate's Fortress and Ikana Castle are perfectly satisfactory as far as names go, and Termina's Bottom of the Well is pretty much just the bottom of a well. It just happens to have mummies in it because it's near Stone Tower Temple, so there's some dead souls trapped down there. But that's pretty much the same for all of Ikana Canyon. So, yeah. You don't even have to fight them, though. Just bring them some stuff to put them to rest. Much better than Hyrule's Underground Torture Cellar and Haunted Bone Pit. So, what's the point to all this nitpicking? Honestly, it's to show that even if a narrative is a secondary concern for your game, you need to give some thought to it. Even something as minor as a dungeon name can have unforeseen consequences for the overall narrative quality of a dungeon, if not given at least some thought. Another point to this video is to show that even the smaller bits of a game, the bits you may not even think about, are worth looking at and analyzing. Take some of your favorite games, or game series sometime, and take a good game series sometime. My brain shut down. And take a good look at the location names. You may be surprised at how much, or even how little, they may say about the location they're attached to. Alright, this has been Kyle Prophet. Thank you all so much for watching. I'll see you all next week when I get even more nitpicky about an even smaller element of game design as I proceed to analyze a title screen. Yes, you heard me right. In the meantime, thank you all, or a main menu screen actually. Either way, still. In the meantime, thank you all so much for watching, and good night, folks.